Tonight on Sleepless Mythology, we invite you to drift off to a time when the gods were petty, the mortals were new, and absolutely nobody labelled things correctly. This is the story of Pandora. A girl, a gift, a jar, not a box, we'll get to that, and the world's worst surprise party. Before we begin, please comment where you are and what time it is so we can see who's joining us from around the world. It's fascinating to discover where you are tuning in from. Now, close your eyes, sink into the covers, take a deep breath and release it, relaxing your face, shoulders and the rest of your body. Let your thoughts slow and let this very old tale carry you gently into slumber. Picture, if you will, the world's first home. Not the sad rental with questionable plumbing that humans live in now, but the original paradise version. A place where disease was just a word nobody had invented yet, where aging was optional, and where the worst thing that could happen to you was getting a sunburn while napping in eternal springtime. Enter Pandora, fresh off the divine assembly line, literally clay-baked to perfection. Each god had contributed to her creation with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for group projects, where everyone actually does their part. Aphrodite stood back, admiring her handiwork. The cheekbones? Divine, if I do say so myself. Athena. I've given her wisdom, though I have a feeling she won't be using it when it matters most. Apollo. I taught her to sing, though maybe we should have stopped at karaoke level. Hermes. I gave her curiosity and charm, maybe a bit too much of both. Zeus, mumbling. And I gave her the ability to ruin everything, but let's keep that part quiet for now. Pandora was the world's first woman, and like many firstborn children, she came with impossibly high expectations and a lot of unsolicited advice. She was beautiful, intelligent, charming and graceful. Imagine if every Instagram influencer were merged into one person, but without the need for filters. Her wedding to Epimetheus was the talk of the ancient world. The guest list was a who's who of Greek mythology, though notably absent was the groom's brother Prometheus, who was a bit tied up at the moment, literally. He was chained to a rock getting his liver eaten daily, but that's another story. The wedding gifts were appropriately divine, celestial jewellery, enchanted textiles, and then there was Zeus's gift, a large jar sealed with divine ribbon, accompanied by the most passive-aggressive gift card in history. To our dearest Pandora, here's a jar, don't open it. No, seriously, don't, like ever. XOXO Zeus. Now if there's one thing the gods were really good at besides turning into animals to pursue romantic interests, it was psychological warfare. They didn't just give Pandora a jar and tell her not to open it. They gave her a jar, told her not to open it, and then made sure she could hear mysterious whispers coming from inside at 3 a.m. The jar sat in their home like the world's worst wedding centerpiece. Pandora would catch herself staring at it during breakfast. Epimetheus. Honey, your ambrosia is getting cold. Pandora, still staring at the jar. Does it sound like it's humming to you? Epimetheus. Maybe it's just the wind. Pandora. We're indoors. Epimetheus. Indoor wind. Days passed. Then weeks. The jar became the elephant in the room. If elephants were mysterious containers of doom that occasionally glowed in the dark, Pandora tried everything to distract herself. Rearranging the furniture, the jar somehow always ended up in her line of sight. Taking up hobby after hobby, the jar seemed to judge her pottery attempts. Counting sheep, the sheep kept morphing into tiny jars in her dreams. Finally, one particularly curious afternoon, Pandora had enough. What's the worst that could happen? She mused, approaching the jar. It's probably just Zeus's collection of embarrassing thunderbolt mishaps or something. The afternoon light filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the room where the jar sat. Pandora's footsteps were silent on the cool stone floor as she approached it, her heart beating in rhythm with the faint pulse she could sense. emanating from within. The jar had been calling to her for weeks now, its whispers growing louder in the depths of night, fainter but still present in the harsh light of day. She traced her fingers along the smooth clay surface, feeling the subtle warmth beneath her touch. The seal was elaborate, marked with symbols she couldn't quite read, their meanings just beyond her grasp. The weight of solitude pressed around her. Epimetheus was in the fields, and the house held only the sound of her own breathing. "Just to understand," she whispered to herself, her voice barely disturbing the air. "Just to know." The seal broke with a sound like a distant sigh. For one moment, one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then darkness began to pour forth, not like liquid, but like soak, like shadow given form. The darkness had texture, had weight, had purpose. It coiled around her arm, brushed against her face with the cold touch of ancient things awakening. She tried to close the jar, but it was too late. The forces within had waited too long, grown too strong. They erupted outward in a torrent of shadow and malice, each one distinct, yet part of the whole. Disease rose first, pallid and patient, bringing fever dreams and wasting agonies. Sorrow followed, heavy and grey, carrying the weight of all future tears. Pain stretched its fingers toward the sky, sharp and eager. Hunger uncurled slowly, hollow-eyed and endless. Age crept forth, quiet but relentless. Death emerged last, bearing finality in its wake. They spiraled upward, outward, taking form and substance as they went, spreading on winds that hadn't existed before this moment. Pandora stood transfixed, watching as each horror discovered its shape, its purpose, its destination. She could feel them changing the world as they passed. The air grew heavier, the shadows deeper, the future darker. In the silence that followed their departure, Pandora's hands trembled as she held the jar. A sound came from within, faint, like the flutter of a bird's wing. Something remained, something waited. From the depths of the jar came a different kind of light. Not the harsh glare of lightning or the cold gleam of stars, but something softer, something that reminded Pandora of dawn breaking over distant mountains. Her tears, shed for what she had unleashed, caught this gentle radiance and held it. A whisper rose from the jar, delicate as morning mist. Hope. It emerged slowly, unlike its violent predecessors. Where they had torn their way free, hope lifted itself with grace, unfurling like the first leaves of spring. It took no definite shape, remaining instead a shimmer in the air, a warmth that touched the heart rather than the skin. Pandora felt its presence settle into the world, weaving itself into the fabric of existence. It followed the paths of the escaped evils, not to fight them, but to walk beside humanity through the darkness they would bring. Where disease would strike, hope would give strength to endure. Where sorrow would dwell, hope would remind hearts of joy's return. Where death would wait, hope would whisper of life's renewal. The light faded, leaving Pandora alone with the empty jar and the weight of understanding. The world had changed. She had changed it. Humanity would never again know the simple peace of that first morning, never return to the age of innocence she had ended with her curiosity. But they would have hope. In the distance she could hear Epimetheus returning. Soon she would have to explain, to watch understanding darken his features, to see him grasp the new reality of their existence. But for now, she stood in the last moments of the old world, holding an empty jar that had contained both humanity's suffering and its salvation. Outside, the first shadow of night fell across the land, but somewhere in that darkness, a small light flickered, refusing to be extinguished. Epimetheus found her still standing there, the jar cradled in her arms like a child. He paused in the doorway, sensing something different in the air, something altered in the quality of light and shadow. The silence between them stretched, heavy with things that could never be unsaid. "I opened it," Pandora whispered, her voice carrying the weight of ages. "I opened it, and everything changed." She watched understanding dawn in his eyes. Not anger, not yet, but a slow creeping comprehension of what had been lost. Outside, the first chill wind ever to blow across their perfect world rattled the olive branches. Somewhere in the distance, someone coughed for the first time in human history. "The air," Epimetheus said, his hand reaching out to touch nothing. "It feels heavier," Pandora finished. "It will always feel heavier now." They stood together at their window watching as the world learned its new nature. In the village below, a child scraped her knee and discovered pain. An old man felt his joints ache and understood aging. A woman clutched her stomach and knew hunger. Humanity was experiencing its first taste of suffering, like bitter wine on untried tongues. But then they saw something else. A mother kissing the child's knee better. A young man helping the elder walk. Someone sharing their bread with the hungry woman. Within hours of receiving suffering, humanity had already learned compassion. "There was something else in the jar," Pandora said softly. "Something that followed the evils. It felt like the first star appearing in a dark sky." Epimetheus took her hand, his warmth a comfort in the new coolness of the evening. They could hear voices rising from the village, not all cries of distress, but also laughter, song, the sounds of people coming together to face their new reality. "Perhaps," he said, "we needed both. The darkness and the light, the suffering and the strength to bear it." Night fell fully then, the first true darkness the world had known. But here and there, fires began to flicker, humans gathering around them, sharing stories, sharing warmth, sharing hope. In those first days after the opening, humanity learned what it meant to need. Before, they'd existed in a state of perpetual contentment, like children who had never known want. Now they discovered the sharp edges of existence, the valleys that made the heights meaningful. The first rains fell, no longer gentle mists, but heavy drops that soaked and chilled. People learned to build shelters, to create walls against the wind. Their hands blistered and cracked with work, but they discovered pride in what those hands could create. The first hunger came, and with it the satisfaction of planting seeds, of tending crops, of sharing harvest. They learned that food tastes sweeter when earned by sweat and patience. Gardens grew where once food had simply appeared, and in the tending of these gardens they found purpose. The first illness struck a child in the village. The mother, finding her daughter burning with fever, felt fear unlike anything she had known in the old world. But as she sat through the long night, cooling the child's forehead with damp cloths, she discovered something profound in the way small hands clutched hers, in the fierce love that made her fight against this new enemy called disease. And death. Death was the hardest lesson. The first time it visited their village, taking an elder in his sleep, they learned grief, but they also learned remembrance, learned to hold memories like precious stones, learned that love could extend beyond the boundaries of existence. Pandora watched it all from her window, witnessing humanity's painful adolescence. She saw them stumble and rise, fail and try again. Each new hardship brought its shadow of suffering, but in that shadow hope's light seemed to shine more brightly. People began to gather in the evenings to share their stories, their struggles, their small victories. They learned to find joy in moments of peace because they now knew peace could end. They learned to celebrate life because they understood its fragility. They learned to love more deeply because they knew loss. In their gardens, they planted flowers alongside their food, beauty amongst necessity. They created art on their walls, sang songs in their work, danced even when tired. Suffering had taught them they could endure, and hope had taught them they could flourish. One evening, as the sun set on this changed world, an old woman approached Pandora. In her hands she held a small clay jar she had made herself, its sides decorated with scenes of both struggle and triumph. "We know it was you who opened the jar," the woman said, her eyes kind rather than accusing. "But perhaps it had to be opened. Perhaps we needed to learn what it means to hope." Pandora lived a long life, though not the eternal one she might have had in the unchanged world. She aged as all humans now did, watching silver thread itself through her dark hair, seeing lines form around her eyes, marks of both laughter and sorrow. She never tried to hide from what she had done. The years that followed the opening, she became something of a keeper of stories, a witness to both humanity's struggles and their triumphs. People would come to her, not for absolution, but for understanding. She could tell them how the world had been before, and somehow this made the present more bearable. Epimetheus stayed by her side, their love deepening in the face of shared burden. Together they raised children who would never know the perfect empty world of before. Their daughters and sons grew up understanding both hardship and hope, perhaps stronger for knowing both. As she grew older, Pandora kept the empty jar. It sat in a place of honour in their home, no longer a source of temptation but a reminder. Sometimes, in the deepest part of night, she thought she could still hear the faintest echo of hope whispering from within it, like a shell holding the sound of a distant sea. In her final years, when her steps had grown slow and her voice soft with age, she would often sit in her garden, watching the interplay of light and shadow. Young mothers would bring their children to hear her speak of the time before, and she would tell them not just of what was lost, but of what was gained. We learned to heal because we knew pain. We learned to build because we knew want. We learned to love deeply because we understood loss. And in all of this, we found something stronger than perfection. We found resilience. When death finally came for Pandora, it came gently, like sleep after a long day's work. They say she smiled at the end, perhaps seeing something beyond the veil that separated life from whatever lay beyond. She was buried with honours, not as the woman who unleashed evil, but as the one who gave humanity its first and last gift, the courage to hope in darkness. The jar was passed down through generations, empty but never meaningless. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, those who keep it say they can still hear it whisper, not with regret, but with the quiet assurance that even in the darkest times, hope remains. In a world where God still walked among mortals, there lived a musician who could make stones weep. His name was Orpheus, and when he played his lyre, rivers would pause their flowing to listen. Trees would bend their branches to hear better. Wild animals would lay down their fangs and claws, transformed by the beauty of his songs. But this isn't really a story about music. It's a story about love and trust, and that most human of flaws, the inability to resist looking back at what we're leaving behind. Orpheus fell in love with a woman named Eurydice, and she with him. Their wedding day was the kind poet's dream of writing about, though none could describe it as beautifully as Orpheus could sing it. She danced through meadows of flowers while he played songs that made the very grass dance with joy. Then came the snake. Hidden in the high grass, disturbed by Eurydice's dancing feet, it struck without warning. A single bite, a single cry, a single moment that changed everything. Eurydice died in Orpheus's arms, his songs of healing powerless against death's finality. His music, which had once made the world dance, now made the stones weep for real. But Orpheus refused to accept that death was the end of their song. No mortal was meant to walk the path to the underworld while still breathing. The road down was more absence than presence, an anti-path, a way of not being that led to the realm of those who no longer were. But Orpheus walked it anyway, his footsteps echoing in ways that suggested space and distance had forgotten how to behave properly. He brought only his lyre and his voice, weapons that seemed absurd against death itself. Yet as he descended, his music changed the very nature of the darkness. Notes of light spiraled through the gloom. The walls of the tunnel, slick with the tears of ages, resonated with his grief. The guardians of Death's realm had never heard anything like it. Charon, the ferryman who had transported souls across the Styx for millennia, found his oar keeping time to the melody. Cerberus, the three-headed hound who had never been soothed by anything less than absolute obedience, laid all 6 of his ears flat against his head and whimpered like a puppy. The very shadows seemed to part before him, drawn by the music of the living, remembering what it meant to dance. When he finally reached the throne room of Hades and Persephone, his song had changed from grief to longing, from loss to love. He sang of Eurydice, not just her death, but her life. He sang of morning light in her hair, of her laugh that made flowers grow faster, of the way she saw beauty in even the smallest things. He sang of a love that refused to end. The sound filled the vast, dark hall, bringing with it echoes of sunlight and spring breezes. Even the ghosts stopped their endless wandering to listen. Persephone, who knew something about moving between the worlds of light and darkness, felt tears freeze on her cheeks. And Hades, who had never been moved by anything in all his eternal reign, who had turned away heroes and kings and gods themselves. Hades leaned forward on his throne of shadows and listened. When the last note faded into the depths of the underworld, silence fell. Not the usual silence of death, but one filled with possibility. Even the river Styx seemed to hold its breath. Hades rose from his throne, his movement like shadows gathering. "No mortal," he said, his voice carrying the weight of all endings, "has ever moved us thus." He glanced at Persephone, who was still brushing frozen tears from her cheeks. "You sing of love as if it was stronger than death." "It is," Orpheus replied, and his simple certainty echoed through the hall more powerfully than his music had. Hades studied him with eyes older than time. "Love," he mused, "and yet also doubt. I see both in you, musician. Tell me, do you trust her as much as you love her?" The question hung in the air like mist over the Styx. Orpheus gripped his lyre tighter. "I would die for her." "That's not what I ask," Hades said softly. "Dying is easy. Trusting is harder." Persephone rose then, her movement like the first thaw of spring. "Husband," she said, "remember how it was in the beginning, when love was new?" Something shifted in Hades' expression, a softening around eyes that had watched countless souls enter his realm. "Very well," he said finally. "You may have your Eurydice back, but there must be a price." Of course there would be a price. There was always a price in dealings with the gods, and the Lord of the Dead's prices was steeper than most. "She will follow you up the path to the living world," Hades continued. "You will hear her footsteps behind you, but if you turn to look at her before you both reach the surface, if you give in to doubt for even a moment, she returns to me, forever." The terms were simple, cruel in their simplicity. Walk away from the underworld, trusting that the love of your life is following, without once looking back to make sure. The path back to life was longer than the descent had been. Each step echoed twice. Orpheus's own footfall, then another. Softer one behind him. Eurydice's steps, or were they? The doubt began to gnaw at him before he'd taken 100 paces. The tunnel twisted upward through darkness so complete it seemed to have weight. The air grew thicker, heavier, filled with whispers that might have been the dead, or might have been his own fears speaking. "Are you sure those footsteps are hers? Hades is the lord of deception as much as death. She might have turned back already. You might be climbing alone." He could not use his lyre to comfort himself. The silence behind him had to be enough, had to be trusted. His fingers ached for strings, his throat for song. But he dared not make a sound that might mask her footsteps. Those footsteps, Sometimes they seemed to fade. Sometimes they seemed to quicken, as if she was struggling to keep up. Sometimes they stopped entirely, and his heart would freeze until they resumed. Was this part of Hades' test, or was she really falling behind? The path grew steeper. His legs trembled with exhaustion, but he didn't dare pause. What if she couldn't stop in time and ran into him? What if the impact made him turn? What if she wasn't there at all? He began to see the first hints of light above, not sunlight yet, but the grey suggestion of dawn. The air carried traces of life, moss, earth, morning dew. He was close, they were close. If she was still there, if, that word echoed in his mind, growing louder with each step, if she was there. If this wasn't a cruel joke by the gods, if she hadn't vanished the moment he started climbing, if he hadn't imagined those footsteps all along. He could almost feel her presence now, almost sense her reaching for him. Or was that just the wind playing tricks? Just his desperate hope creating phantoms? The exit was just ahead. 10 more steps. 5, 3, 1 more step would have been enough. One more moment of faith. Later, Orpheus would never be able to explain exactly why he turned. Was it the sudden silence behind him? The brush of what felt like fingers against his arm? Or simply the human impossibility of not looking? Like a scar that must be touched? Like a wound that must be witnessed? He turned. For a fraction of a second, less time than it takes for a heart to beat, he saw her, Eurydice, still wrapped in the grey mists of death, but there, solid, real, reaching for him. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw joy transform into understanding, transform into farewell. "Oh," she said, just that one soft syllable of recognition, of knowing what would happen next. Then she began to fade, like morning mist before the sun. Orpheus reached for her, his fingers passing through where her hand had been. He tried to grab her, to hold on, to deny what was happening, but it was like trying to catch smoke. "Eurydice!" His cry echoed through both worlds, but she was already gone, pulled back down to the realm of shadows. This time her descent was swift and silent. No footsteps marked her passing. Orpheus fell to his knees in the threshold between worlds, one hand still reaching into darkness, the other clutching useless handfuls of dirt in the world of the living. Above him, dawn was breaking. Birds began their morning songs. The world continued, indifferent to what had just been lost. He stayed there for 7 days and 7 nights, playing his lyre and singing to the entrance of the underworld. His music, once capable of moving stones, now carried nothing but grief. The stones wept again, but the doors to death remained closed. On the 8th day he rose and walked away from that place, but he was no longer fully in the world of the living. Part of him had turned to shadow with Eurydice. Orpheus wandered, though no one would call what he did living. He moved through the world like a ghost himself, playing songs that made even the most joyful occasions feel like funeral dirges. Spring flowers wilted when he passed. His grief was so pure, so complete, that nature itself seemed to bow under its weight. He refused all other loves, all comfort. When women approached him, drawn by his music and his sorrow, he turned away. His heart had died with Eurydice, not once, but twice, and what remained was just an echo, beating out of habit rather than purpose. The Maenads, wild women devoted to Dionysus, took offence at his rejection of love and life. They saw his unending mourning as an insult to their god of wine and revelry, their god who celebrated the passionate joy of being alive. One night, drunk on wine and religious frenzy, they found him by a river, playing those endless songs of grief. The sound of their approach was masked by thunder, by their own wild cries, by the drums they beat in worship of their god. They fell upon him like a storm. His death was violent, but they say he smiled at the end, the first smile to cross his lips since that fatal look back. The Maenads tore him apart and scattered his remains, but his head, still singing, floated down the river Hebrus to the sea. Even in death, his voice did not cease. His head washed up on the shores of Lesbos, still singing Eurydice's name. They say the nightingales there still sing more sweetly than anywhere else in the world, having learned their songs from his last laments. And his soul, it descended once more to the underworld, but this time not as a visitor. This time he went as all souls must go, fully, finally, freely. They say that when Orpheus's soul arrived in the underworld for the last time, he did not come playing songs of petition or protest. He came in silence, head bowed, ready at last to be merely one more shade among the countless dead. But the underworld remembered him. As he crossed the Styx, Charon did not ask for payment. The ferryman still hummed fragments of the songs Orpheus had played on his first journey. Cerberus lowered all three heads as he passed, a gesture of respect for the one mortal who had soothed his eternal vigilance. The spirits of the dead parted before him, not in fear but in recognition. Among them he walked with purpose now, no longer a visitor trying to steal back life, but a soul seeking its other half. He found her in the fields of Asphodel, where ordinary souls spend eternity in a kind of peaceful forgetting. But Eurydice had not forgotten. How could she, when his songs about her had echoed through the halls of death for so long? When their eyes met this time, there was no danger in the looking, no price to pay for turning, no more tests or trials or bargains with gods. They say she smiled, that smile he had crossed death to see again. They say he did not need his lyre any more, because the silence between them held all the music that mattered. In death they found what life and love and desperate bargains could not give them. Time without ending, presence without fear of loss. Love without the need to look back and make sure it was still there. Some versions of the story end there, with them together in the gentle gloom of Asphodel. But others say that Persephone, remembering her own journeys between light and shadow, between love and loss, gave them a special dispensation. In these tellings, Orpheus and Eurydice spend half the year in the Elysian fields, where heroes and blessed souls dwell in eternal light, and half in the peaceful shadows of Asphodel, balanced, like all great love stories, between darkness and light. And in the world above, when musicians play songs of love and loss, some say they're really echoing the endless duet of two souls who proved that even death could not part them forever. It just required patience and the wisdom to stop looking back.